There is no pain quite like losing a child, and no loneliness quite like carrying that grief alone for years with no one to share it. Jonah Pike knew both. He lived deep in the mountains, trapping furs and speaking to no one. Then one afternoon, cruel men tried to sell a young woman with a sack over her head. Most people walked away. Jonah simply didn't. With only $3 left, he paid. When he lifted that sack, tired eyes looked up at him, and the girl whispered just one single word. That word shattered something inside Jonah he believed was gone forever. What happens when one quiet act of kindness gives a broken man his whole world back? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains did not care whether a man was happy or broken. They rose the same in every season, white and enormous in winter, dark green and indifferent in summer, and they asked nothing of the people who lived in their shadow except endurance. Jonah Pike had been enduring for a long time. He had built his cabin in the upper reach of the Greyhorn Valley when he was 26 years old, young enough to believe that hard work and clean living were sufficient armor against the world's worst offerings. The cabin sat on a bench of land above a creek that ran cold even in August, shaded by a stand of old-growth pines whose trunks were wider than a man's arm span. He had felled 3 of them to build the walls and left the rest standing, because even then, he had understood that some things were worth keeping exactly as they were. That had been 18 years ago. The cabin had settled and darkened with time. The chinking between the logs repacked each autumn. The roof replaced once when a wet snow caved it in. The door rehung twice when the frame warped. The inside was spare and deliberate. A stone hearth along the north wall, a plank table with 2 chairs that had not been used in years, a cot against the east wall with a wool blanket folded across it, and a single shelf near the window that held 3 things: a tin of tobacco he rarely touched anymore, a worn Bible he read only when the nights grew very long, and a small carved figure of a sparrow, no bigger than a man's fist, set in the exact spot where the morning light would find it first. He had made the sparrow himself over the course of a long February, carving it from a piece of white pine with a small knife, working slowly and without any particular plan, letting the shape declare itself from the wood the way such things do when a man works with his hands in the absence of conversation. It was not fine work by any craftsman's standard, but it was honest work, and the bird had a quality of alertness in its posture, head slightly tilted, as though listening, that Jonah had not planned but could not have improved upon if he had. Jonah's days followed a rhythm that had calcified over years into something close to ritual. He rose before full light, started the fire, boiled coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and ate whatever was left from the night before. He was not a man who required variety in his meals. Salt pork and cornbread served him through most of the winter, supplemented in autumn by whatever small game he took on the lines, and in summer by the fish he pulled from the cold creek below the bench. He had tried to keep the vegetable garden going for several years after Clara died, but the truth was that he had never understood it the way she had. She had known exactly when to plant, and exactly how much water was too much, and exactly which patches of ground on the south slope were worth cultivating and which would produce nothing but frustration. Without her knowledge, the garden had declined from a genuine source of food to a small patch of weeds he turned over each spring, more out of habit than expectation, until eventually he stopped turning it over at all. By the time the sky was pale gray above the eastern ridge each morning, he was already moving, checking his trap lines, which ran along 2 creek drainages and covered roughly 14 miles of rough country if you walked them all in a single day, which he sometimes did in the deep cold of January when the marten were moving and the time spent in the cabin was time wasted. He was a capable trapper, not the best in the territory but among the most consistent. He understood animal behavior with the particular intimacy that comes from years of patient observation, rather than book learning. He knew which sets the beaver would avoid after a hard rain, which ridgelines the fox traveled at dusk, and how the marten changed their patterns when a great horned owl established a new hunting territory. He knew these things the way old men know weather, not from calculation, but from accumulated feeling, a deep residue of experience that had become instinct. He was 44 years old. His hair had gone the color of iron fillings, cut bluntly and without vanity. His face was seamed from years of wind and cold, and his hands were large and scarred in the small ways that hands get scarred when they work hard for a long time. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the particular uprightness of someone who has learned that the world will not accommodate you if you make yourself smaller. People who met him in town generally found him agreeable enough. He answered questions directly, paid his debts promptly, and made no trouble. But there was something in him that discouraged prolonged conversation, a quality of stillness that was not quite unfriendliness, but was not quite warmth either. It was simply distance. A great settled distance that he wore the way other men wore hats. He had not always been this way. There had been a time, not so long ago, that he couldn't remember it clearly, when Jonah Pike had been someone who laughed easily, who sang while he worked, who kept a garden behind the cabin because Clara liked fresh vegetables and because he liked doing things that pleased her. Clara. He let himself think her name now without flinching, which had taken years. Clara Moss when he married her, Clara Pike after, a woman from the lower valley whose father had run a small sawmill and whose mother had died young enough that Clara had grown up knowing what it meant to manage without. She had been practical and quietly funny, and possessed of a steadiness that Jonah had recognized, even at 23, as something rare and worth holding on to.
They had been married in the spring of the year Jonah turned 25, in a small ceremony at the Calder's Crossing Church, with Reverend Alt officiating, and perhaps 20 people in attendance, most of them Claire's relations from the valley below. Jonah's family was sparse. A brother 2 territories east he wrote to twice a year, and saw less than that. But he had not minded. He had Clara, and Clara had been enough. May came the following winter, born during a hard freeze when the creek outside ran silent under 2 feet of ice and the pine boughs sagged with snow. The birth had been difficult and the recovery long, but Clara had come through it with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. And May had arrived in the world squalling and red-faced and entirely herself from the first moment. Jonah had held her that first night, the cabin warm against the cold, Clara sleeping at last in the exhaustion that follows great effort. And he had understood for the first time what people meant when they said that love could rearrange a man's interior entirely. He had felt himself reorganized, simplified. He had become, in that moment, primarily a father, and everything else, trapper, husband, mountain man, had arranged itself behind that fact, like mountains behind a foreground peak. May had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and the combination produced a child who was simultaneously easy to love and difficult to manage, which suited Jonah perfectly. He had taught her to walk the trap lines with him by the time she was 4, carrying nothing, just walking and watching, and asking questions in the steady, relentless way that children ask questions when they are genuinely curious about the world. She had named the carved sparrow. She had called it Thomas, for no reason she could explain, and the name had stuck. Clara died in the spring of May's 6th year, of a fever that started as something ordinary and became, over the course of 9 terrible days, something that no amount of determination could hold off. The doctor from the valley below arrived on the 7th day and did what he could, which was not enough. Jonah had sat with her through the last 2 nights, holding her hand, speaking quietly about nothing consequential. The garden, the creek, the way the light fell on the upper ridge in late afternoon, because he could not speak about the things that mattered, and she could no longer answer him anyway. She had passed on a Tuesday morning, with the sun coming through the window and May sitting in the next room, too young to understand fully what was happening, and too old not to feel it. The 3 years after Clara's death were the hardest of Jonah's life, and he had done his best to hold himself together for May's sake, which was the only reason that worked. He had kept the garden, badly, but he had kept it. He had continued the trap lines. He had read to May in the evenings from the Bible and from the one book of poetry that Clara had carried to the mountains in her trunk, a worn volume with a cracked spine whose author Jonah could never remember. May had loved the poems. She had memorized several of them and would recite them while she walked, in the flat, serious voice that children use when they are doing something they consider important. And then, in the autumn of May's 9th year, she was gone. Jonah had been 3 days deep in the mountains, running his northern trap line, the one that required an overnight camp at the upper drainage. He had returned to find the cabin door standing open and May nowhere on the property. He had searched for 4 days before riding down to Calder's Crossing for help. They had searched for 2 weeks total. The townspeople, men from the valley below, the county sheriff who rode up once, asked questions and rode away again with nothing resolved. There had been signs of horses near the cabin, unshod horses, and one person in town said they had seen a group of rough men passing through 2 days before Jonah returned, moving east. No one had seen a child with them. No one had seen anything definitive at all. The not knowing had been the worst of it. Jonah had told himself, in the first year, that she was alive somewhere, that someone had taken her, and that she was being cared for, however imperfectly. He had told himself this for long enough that it became a kind of faith. Not a cheerful faith, nothing like hope exactly, but a grim insistence on one particular possibility over all the darker ones. He still held it 8 years later, though it had thinned with time into something more like a habit of thought than a genuine belief. The carved sparrow sat on the windowsill, and he kept it clean, and he kept it positioned to catch the morning light. And that was the extent of what Jonah Pike allowed himself by way of memorial. He had 2 good friends in the territory, which was 2 more than some men managed. Hector Briggs ran the trading post at Calder's Crossing, a low-roofed building at the center of a rough grid of streets that charitably constituted a town. Hector was 61, had been in the territory since before statehood, and possessed the kind of blunt, ungarnished decency that long years and hard country tend to produce in men who start out decent to begin with. He was built like a barrel, broad through the chest and short in the leg, with a red face that suggested either good health or a lifetime of cold wind. Probably both. He kept a ledger behind the trading post counter that recorded every transaction he had ever made, going back 20 years, written in a cramped and careful hand that was entirely at odds with his physical roughness. He was not a man who asked questions he didn't need answered, which Jonah valued enormously. When Jonah came down from the mountain twice yearly, once in late autumn with his winter catch, and once in early spring with what the season had yielded, Hector would buy the furs at a fair price, offer Jonah coffee that was marginally worse than Jonah's own, and speak with him for an hour or 2 about the practical matters of the territory, without once venturing into the personal. It was a friendship built on mutual respect and deliberate restraint, and it suited them both. The other was Reverend Thomas Alt, who had come to Calder's Crossing 12 years earlier to minister to a congregation that numbered, on a good Sunday, perhaps 30 souls, and who had stayed long past the point where a younger or more ambitious man would have moved on to a larger posting. Alt was 65, thin as wire, with white hair and very dark eyes, and the kind of face that had been weathered into a map of everything he had seen and thought and prayed over. He was not a man who pushed his faith onto others. He seemed to understand that faith, like love, takes hold or doesn't, based on conditions that human effort can prepare for, but not guarantee. And so his friendship with Jonah, who was not a religious man in any formal sense, had none of the friction that such friendships can carry. He simply respected Jonah, worried about him in a quiet, sustained way, and kept his door open. It was late October when Jonah loaded his furs onto the mule and headed down toward Calder's Crossing for his autumn trade. The aspens had already gone gold, and the higher peaks above the valley showed new snow, and the air had that particular cold clarity that comes just before the serious weather settles in for the winter. He had a good catch: 37 marten, 14 beaver, a handful of fox, and he needed to resupply before the passes became difficult. Salt, flour, coffee, lamp oil, the necessities. He calculated what he would have left after the supplies and Hector's cut, and it was not much, but it was enough to see him through to spring, and enough had always been sufficient. He did not expect anything out of the ordinary from this trip. He never did. The road down from the mountain was the same road it always was. The town at the end of it was the same town it always was. And Jonah Pike was, he believed, done with ordinary life surprising him. He was wrong about that. He was entirely, completely, and permanently wrong about that, though he did not yet know it as he rode down through the golden aspens with his furs bundled on the mule, and the cold air working at his face, and Thomas, the carved sparrow, sitting on the windowsill back in. The empty cabin, positioned precisely to catch the first light of morning. Hector weighed the last of the marten pelts, and wrote the figure in his ledger, with the careful deliberation of a man who has never once rounded a number in his favor. He counted the coins out on the counter one at a time, and Jonah counted them again silently, not because he doubted Hector, but because it was the kind of transaction that deserved the respect of being counted twice. "Good winter," Hector said, which from Hector was equivalent to a lengthy compliment from anyone else. "Fair," Jonah said. He bought his supplies in the order he had written them down before leaving the cabin: salt, flour, coffee, lamp oil, 2 boxes of ammunition, a block of hard cheese that he would eat through the first 2 weeks before it turned. He tallied the total himself while Hector assembled the items, and when the accounting was finished, he had $3.11 remaining in his coin pouch. It was enough. It was, as he had calculated, sufficient. He was loading the supplies onto the mule outside the trading post when he heard the commotion at the far end of the main street near the livery stable. It was not a loud commotion, no shouting, no gunfire, none of the straightforward violence that a frontier town occasionally produced, and that had a recognizable and navigable character of its own. It was something quieter, and in its quietness more troubling. The sound of a small crowd gathered in the way crowds gather when they are watching something they are not sure they should watch. The shuffling, uncertain murmur of people who have not yet decided whether to stay or go. Jonah finished tying the second bundle onto the mule. He told himself he had no business at the livery stable. He told himself the afternoon was short, and the road back to the mountain was long and the weather had been unreliable. He stood with his hands on the mule's lead rope for a moment, and then he walked toward the commotion, because there was something in the quality of that murmur, something specifically wrong in it, that would not let him do otherwise. There were perhaps 15 people at the edge of the livery yard, arranged in the loose half-circle of collective discomfort, arms crossed, eyes elsewhere, the posture of people present at something they wish they were absent from, but have not found the will to leave. In the center of the yard stood 3 men and a young woman. The men were not from Calder's Crossing. Jonah could see that immediately. The largest of the 3 stood slightly forward of the others. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, flat face and eyes that were a very pale gray, almost colorless. He wore a good coat over poor clothes and carried himself with the ease of a man who has found that people generally step out of his way. His name, Jonah would learn, was Dread Cully. What Jonah could read in him from 20 yards was sufficient. This was a man who had learned to dress cruelty in the language of business. The young woman stood between the 2 smaller men, her wrists bound in front of her with a length of rope that was not tight enough to be torture, but was tight enough to make a clear statement. A coarse burlap sack had been pulled over her head, tied loosely at the neck with a cord. She was dressed in a plain brown dress that had been good once, and was no longer. She stood with her shoulders drawn up slightly, not quite a flinch, not quite defiance, something in between, and her bound hands were pressed together at her waist in a way that might have looked like prayer. Cully was speaking to the crowd in the unhurried, almost amiable tone of a man conducting ordinary commerce. $3, he said. That is what I'm asking. And I am asking it as a courtesy and an act of goodwill toward this community because, frankly, she has been more trouble than she is worth at twice that figure. She owes a debt, a legitimate, documented debt. And I am offering the opportunity for some charitable soul to assume that debt in exchange for her labor and her service, and I will consider the matter settled and trouble this town no further. The crowd said nothing. That was the worst thing about it, Jonah would think later. Not Cully's words, which were contemptible but not surprising, but the silence of the 15 people who stood there and said nothing and did nothing, each of them presumably hoping that someone else would act so they would not have to. Reverend Alt was not in the crowd. Hector was behind his counter. The sheriff's office, Jonah noted with a cold eye, appeared to be empty. One man at the edge of the crowd, a farmer Jonah recognized by his height and his red scarf, cleared his throat and said he wasn't interested and walked away. 3 others followed him. The remaining crowd contracted slightly. More faces turned away. Cully waited with the patience of a man who had done this before. Jonah stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the young woman with the sack over her head. He could see nothing of her face. He could see the slight rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed, and the way her bound hands pressed together just a little more tightly each time Cully spoke. In the deliberate stillness she was maintaining with what he could tell was enormous effort. He thought about May. He did not intend to. He never intended to think about May. The thought simply appeared, the way a tooth makes itself known when it begins to ache. But he stood in that livery yard, and he looked at the bound and hooded figure of a young woman, and he thought about his daughter, and his feet did not move toward the road. He put his hand into his coat pocket and felt the coin pouch, $3.11. He walked forward through the remaining cluster of onlookers, and they parted for him without being asked, perhaps sensing something in his forward movement that made negotiation seem unnecessary. I'll take her, Jonah said. Cully looked at him with those pale, assessing eyes, looked at the coat, the worn boots, the mule tied up the street, and seemed to run a rapid calculation. $3, Cully said, in hand. Jonah counted out $3 from the pouch and placed the coins in Cully's open palm, without looking at the man's face. He heard one of the other 2 men make a sound that was not quite a laugh. He ignored it. He stepped to the young woman's side. He reached up and untied the cord at her neck with careful hands, and then lifted the sack clear of her head. She was young, younger than he had expected, though he had not known what he was expecting. 19, perhaps, or close to it. She had dark hair pulled back and a face that would have been pretty in any other circumstance, the bones of it fine and even. But what struck him was not her looks. It was her eyes. They were brown and very tired, the eyes of someone who has been handling too much for too long, and they contained no anger and no self-pity, just a profound, bottomless wariness that Jonah recognized because he had seen it in his own reflection often enough to know what it meant. She looked at him. He understood that she was looking at a 44-year-old man with iron gray hair and a weathered face, a stranger in a coat that smelled of pine pitch and animal musk, who had just paid $3 for her release in a livery yard in front of a crowd of people who had done nothing. He watched her take in the details of his face, the crease of the brow, the line of the jaw, something in the angle of his cheekbones in the cold afternoon light, and he watched something shift in her expression that he could not quite name. She opened her mouth and said one word, Papa. It came out quietly, hardly more than a breath, and it was clearly not a calculated thing. It did not have the quality of strategy or manipulation. It had the quality of something that escapes before a person can stop it, a recognition so deep and so unexpected that it bypasses the guarding mind entirely and simply arrives. Jonah went absolutely still. The word moved through him the way cold water moves through a crack in stone, finding every hollow, every sealed-off space, every place where he had packed the grief in tight and told himself it was finished. He felt his eyes sting, and he did not try to prevent it. He stood in the middle of that livery yard, with the burlap sack in his hands, and the coin pouch empty in his pocket, and the crowd dispersing quietly around him. And he looked at this young woman, who had said a word that neither of them fully understood, and he did not speak. He reached forward and untied the rope at her wrists. He took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders. Then he turned and walked her away from the livery yard, toward the mule, toward the road, toward the mountain, and neither of them said anything more for a very long time. The road back up to the mountain was 4 hours on foot at a reasonable pace, and they walked most of it in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, exactly. It was the silence of two people who have just come through something strange together and have not yet found the language for what it was. Jonah walked on the left with the mule's lead rope in his hand, and the girl, he did not know her name yet, walked on the right with his coat wrapped around her shoulders, her bound redness already fading from her wrists in the cold air. She did not lean on him. She did not require assistance on the rough trail. She simply walked, and she watched everything around her with those careful, tired eyes, and she did not speak. Jonah appreciated that. He was not a man who filled silence easily, and he was not going to begin doing so now. About 2 miles up the mountain, where the trail narrowed and the pines closed in on both sides so that the light went thin and green, he said, "My name is Jonah Pike. My cabin is another 2 hours from here. You are welcome to stay as long as you need." She walked several paces before she answered. "Eliza," she said, just the one word the way she had offered the other one, quietly, without ceremony. "Eliza," he repeated, to show he had heard. Then they were quiet again, and the mule's hooves were soft on the pine needle trail, and the shadows grew longer as the afternoon shortened toward evening. The cabin was cold when they arrived. Jonah built the fire first, as he always did on his return from town, laid the tinder, struck the flint, fed the small flame with careful patience until the stone hearth was throwing adequate heat into the room. He had noticed Eliza standing in the doorway for a moment after they arrived, her eyes moving through the space with the systematic attention of someone looking for things they need to know about. He did not remark on it. He understood it. He made a simple meal, salt pork from the new supply, cornbread mixed and baked in the iron pan over the fire, black coffee poured into the 2 tin cups that sat on the shelf. He set both cups on the table without deliberation, as though it were something he did every day, though the truth was that the second cup had sat unused on that shelf for years, present out of some stubbornness he had never examined closely. Then he set a plate across from his own. He saw her notice the second cup. He saw something shift briefly in her face, not quite emotion, more the shadow of it, the way a cloud makes its presence known not by what you see, but by the brief change in the quality of the light. They sat down across from each other at the plank table, and Jonah said a short and entirely private grace that consisted mostly of gratitude for the fact that he had something to put on the table, and then they ate. She ate with hunger but not desperation, the careful hunger of someone who has learned not to show how much they need. Jonah did not watch her. He ate his own food and looked at the fire and let her have whatever privacy the meal could offer. When they were finished, he poured more coffee and he said, "You are free to leave at first light if that is your preference. I will not stop you and I will not ask you where you intend to go. If you need supplies for the road, I will give you what I can spare. If you want to stay, there's a cot near the stove that is decent enough, and you can have it as long as you need it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. She looked at him with that measuring, careful look that he was beginning to understand was simply how she encountered the world. Not suspicion exactly, more a habit of verification. "Why did you pay for me?" she asked. It was not an aggressive question. It was a genuine one, asked in a level voice by someone who needed the answer in order to make accurate calculations about her situation. Jonah thought about it for a moment. He could have offered several true answers. He could have said that he was thinking about May. He could have said that the crowd's silence had offended something deep in him. He could have said that $3 had seemed, in that specific moment, like the exact right use of $3. He said, couldn't walk past it. She received this. She was quiet for a while, looking at the fire, and then her eyes traveled to the shelf near the window, to the carved wooden sparrow positioned in the last remaining slant of daylight. She looked at it for a long time. She did not ask about it. Jonah did not explain it. But something in the room shifted in the manner of rooms when two people have passed through a threshold together without either of them quite announcing it. He washed the cups and the plates while she sat near the fire. He gave her the extra blanket from the trunk at the foot of the cot. He set a candle on the small shelf near the cot's head, in case she woke in the night and needed to see. Then he took his chair by the window, where he generally sat in the evenings, and he opened the Bible on his knee, not to read exactly, but because the habit of it was familiar, and familiar things helped. After a while, he became aware that she had fallen asleep. He could hear her breathing slow into the deep regularity of genuine, exhausted sleep, and something about that sound loosened a tightness in his chest that he had not acknowledged was there. She was safe. Whatever else was uncertain, and much was, she was safe here tonight, in this cabin, with the fire built up and the door latched against the cold. Jonah put the Bible down on the table. He picked up the carved sparrow from the shelf and held it in his palm, the way he did on nights when the quiet pressed too hard. He turned it over once, feeling the familiar weight of it, the worn smoothness where his thumb had worn away the rougher finish. She had said the word without thinking. He understood that. He understood that it had been involuntary, born of some visual similarity, the jaw, perhaps, or the tired set of the eyes, and that it meant nothing beyond the moment in which it was said. And yet, he sat with the sparrow in his hand for a long time, not thinking, or thinking in the way that is less thought and more weather, things moving through him that had no names yet. Outside, the wind had come up along the ridge, and was working at the corner of the cabin where the chinking was thinnest. The fire had settled to a steady amber. Eventually, Jonah put the sparrow back in its place on the windowsill. He pulled his blanket around his shoulders and closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time, but when he finally did, it was the first genuinely restful sleep he had managed, and longer than he could clearly remember. Days passed the way days do in the mountains in late autumn, short on light and long on quiet. The first frost came hard 2 nights after Eliza arrived, and the world outside the cabin turned stiff and silver every morning before softening by midday. Jonah kept his trap lines going, and Eliza, without being asked, began doing things around the cabin. Not everything, and not with any announcement. She simply moved through the space and noticed what needed doing. She restacked the firewood that had gotten loose against the east wall. She found the broom behind the door and used it. One afternoon, Jonah came back from the lines to find a pot of beans simmering on the hearth, and the smell of it, ordinary, domestic, improbably welcoming, stopped him just inside the door for a moment before he could make himself move normally. "You cook?" he said. "Some," she said, and that was the whole of it. She was not warm exactly, not in the way that Clara had been warm, easy with words, and unafraid of closeness. Eliza held herself at a careful distance from everyone and everything, the way a person does when they have learned repeatedly that closeness has a cost. But she was present, and she was real, and after weeks of pure solitude, the simple fact of another human being moving through the cabin carried more weight than Jonah would have expected. On the 5th day, he was working at the creek crossing below the cabin. The footlog had shifted in the last rain and needed resetting, when the sound of her laughter reached him through the pines. He stopped what he was doing. It was brief, a single, genuine, unguarded laugh, surprised out of her by something. He looked up and saw her standing 20 yards upstream, where the trail crossed a shallow gravel bar. The mule, which Jonah had left tied nearby, had gotten the lead rope looped around a birch sapling and was expressing its objections in the long-suffering theatrical manner of mules. And Eliza was watching it with a hand pressed to her mouth, and the laugh already fading back into composure. She caught Jonah looking at her, and the composure returned fully. But it had been there. It had been real. He went back to work on the footlog and said nothing about it. 2 days after that, he brought home a red-tailed hawk with an injured wing caught in one of his sets by accident. It was a young bird, strong enough to be worth the trouble of setting the wing if the damage was manageable. He laid it on the table and examined the injury with careful hands, and Eliza came and stood across the table, watching. He splinted the wing with a thin piece of shaved pine and a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt, working slowly and talking quietly to the bird in the low, steady voice he used for all animals under stress. He was aware of Eliza's close attention, but did not address it until he had finished and the bird was calm. "You've done that before," she said. "Broken things need setting," he said. "Otherwise they heal wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know what that is, the healing wrong part." He looked at her across the table. She was looking at the hawk, not at him, and her face had that still inward quality that he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when something had reached past her defenses before she could arrange them properly. He did not push. He simply waited. After a while, she told him the outline of it. An orphan. She had no memory of her mother, and the people who had told her about her origins had told her very little. She had been taken in before she was old enough to remember, by a family called Crane in the Harlan Valley, 3 counties east. The Cranes were not unkind exactly. There was a difference, she said carefully, between people who mean you harm and people who simply do not think of you as someone to whom harm can be done. She had worked for them for as long as she could work, and when she was 17, a debt of the father's had been settled by transferring her, like furniture, she said, flat and without bitterness, to a man named Cully, who had used her as labor and leverage across 3 territories before deciding she was more trouble than the profit she represented. She told this without self-pity and without dramatization, in the same measured, factual voice she used for most things. Jonah listened and did not interrupt and did not offer the kind of reflexive consolation that would have diminished the weight of what she was describing. When she finished, he said, "You are not those people's property. You never were." She looked at him directly, which she did rarely. "I know that," she said. "I have always known that. Knowing it and being able to act on it are separate problems." She reached up and touched the outside of her dress at the chest, a brief checking gesture, the hand pressing once against some small, hard shape beneath the fabric, and then withdrawing. Gone almost before it registered. Jonah noticed it and filed it away without comment. Whatever she carried there was hers, and it would remain hers until she chose otherwise. That evening, a passing trapper named Orvis, who sometimes brought messages from Calder's Crossing when his route brought him through the valley, knocked at the cabin door and handed Jonah a folded note from Hector Briggs. Jonah thanked the man and offered him coffee, which Orvis declined. He was pushing to make the North Fork camp before dark. Jonah read the note by the light of the fire, after Eliza had gone to her cot. Hector's handwriting was large and deliberate, a man unaccustomed to letters making each word count. Cully asking around town about the girl. Asking who you are and where you live. Says she is his property under a contract of debt. Thought you should know. Watch yourself up there. Jonah read it twice. He folded it along its original creases and placed it in the locked box on the high shelf. He sat for a moment looking at the fire. Then he rose, took his rifle from the pegs above the door and checked the action. A slow, methodical check, the way a man does when he is not in a hurry but wants to know the condition of things. He replaced it on the pegs and went back to his chair. Eliza lay on her cot with her back to the room. He could not tell if she was asleep. He chose to assume she was, because the alternative, that she had heard the knock and the reading of the note and the checking of the rifle and understood exactly what it meant, was not a thing he could address tonight. There would be a time for addressing it. That time was not now, while the fire was still good and she was resting and the mountain was quiet in every direction. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like a long, slow exhalation, and the fire spoke softly to itself in the hearth, and in the space between the two sounds, Jonah Pike sat and kept watch over a life that had, without his planning for it, becomes something worth watching over. November came down from the higher peaks in earnest, and with it the kind of cold that has weight to it. Cold you can feel pressing on the walls of the cabin, testing the chinking, finding the gaps around the door frame that no amount of careful work entirely seals. 2 feet of snow fell over 3 days in the second week of the month, and the trail down to Calder's Crossing disappeared under it entirely. The mountain closed around the cabin like a hand. Jonah and Eliza were fully isolated now, and both of them knew it, and neither of them remarked on it. They were practical people, and they treated the winter isolation as what it was, a condition to be managed, not a crisis to be lamented. There was wood enough for 2 months. There was food enough for 3 if they were sensible. The cabin was sound. These were the important facts. What changed with the isolation was the quality of the evenings. Before the heavy snow, the days had been full enough. Jonah on the trap lines, Eliza at the cabin, that the evenings, though quiet, had retained a sense of provisional possibility, the feeling that at any moment one of them could simply leave, go into town, expand the perimeter of the world they were sharing. With that possibility removed, the evenings became the whole of the social world, and they expanded to fill it. They talked more, not freely, not with the easy pour of long-established friendship, but in the way that people talk when they have decided cautiously that the other person is worth the effort. Jonah told her practical things first, how he read the weather from the high ridge, how the beaver behaved before a hard freeze, which herbs Clara had dried and hung from the ceiling rafters in autumn, and what they were for. Eliza listened with genuine attention. She had a quality of listening that Jonah had rarely encountered. She did not wait for her turn to speak. She actually heard what he was saying, considered it, and responded to it. One evening near the end of November, with the fire built high against a wind that had been working at the north wall for 2 days, Eliza set down the piece of mending she had taken up and asked him directly whether he had ever had children. The pause before he answered was the longest pause in any conversation they had yet had. "A daughter," he said. "Her name was May." Eliza waited. She understood by now that Jonah's pauses were not hesitation. They were composition. A man who chose his words carefully and needed the time to choose them. "She disappeared," he said. 8 years ago. She was 9 years old. I was away on the trap lines. I came back, and she was gone." He looked at the fire. No answers. The sheriff came up once, took a look at nothing, and went back down. "A few people in town helped me search for 2 weeks. After that, I searched alone for another month, before the weather stopped me. Not knowing is the hardest kind of grief," Eliza said. He looked at her. She said it not as comfort, but as fact, which was the right way to say it. "It is," he agreed. They were quiet together for a while, and the wind found its way under the door, and the fire answered it with a brief gutter, and then steadied. That night, after Eliza had fallen asleep, Jonah went to the old trunk at the foot of the cot and opened it carefully, trying not to make noise, though the hinges were well oiled and gave him nothing. He lifted out a folded square of patchwork quilt from the bottom of the trunk. Beneath Clara's good dress and a bundle of letters he never read anymore. The quilt was made from scraps of Clara's dresses and May's childhood clothes, pieced together in that first hard winter after Clara died when Jonah had needed something to do with his hands during the long evenings. It was not fine quilting. The stitches were large and the pattern irregular, but it was warm, and it smelled of cedar from the trunk, and holding it was like holding the outline of everything that used to fill the cabin. He placed it over Eliza where the wool blanket had slipped, tucking it gently at the edges. She did not stir. In the morning she came to the table and he set the coffee out, and neither of them spoke about the quilt. But she had smoothed it and folded it with care and placed it at the foot of the cot, and he understood that she had received it. The hawk's wing healed steadily over those weeks. Jonah had built a rough enclosure in the corner of the lean-to shed, large enough for the bird to extend its wings without striking the walls, and he fed it daily from the trapping scraps. Eliza had taken an interest in the bird from the beginning, and by the 3rd week, she was the one who fed it more often than not, moving quietly and without sudden gestures in the way that Jonah had taught her. On the first clear morning after the long gray stretch, she carried the hawk outside and released it. She stood in the snow with the bird raised in both hands, and I looked at her for a moment with its amber eye, looked at her seriously the way raptors do, and then it lifted. She stood watching it rise until it was too small to track against the white sky. Jonah watched her from the cabin door. 3 days after that, Orvis came through again on his northern route, which meant the trail was passable for a man on snowshoes. He brought a second note from Hector, longer this time and more carefully written. Cully had sent one of his men to the base of the mountain trail, asking that Jonah come down to town to discuss what Cully was calling unfinished business. The man had waited a day and then left, but the message was clear enough. Cully had not let the matter go. Jonah sent Orvis back with a single spoken reply. Tell Hector that Jonah Pike has nothing to discuss with Dread Cully, and that Dread Cully is welcome to take whatever business he believes he has to the county seat. That evening, Reverend Alt arrived at the cabin unannounced. Breathing hard from the climb and stomping snow from his boots on the porch boards with the deliberate energy of a man who has made up his mind to do something and has not entirely lost his nerve about it. Jonah put coffee on, and they sat on the porch in the cold. Alt had asked to speak with Jonah alone first, which Jonah respected, and the Reverend said that he had heard about the girl, about what Jonah had done in the livery yard, and about Cully's inquiries, and that he had come because he was concerned and because he had a few questions that were more practical than theological. They talked for 30 minutes in the manner of two men who trust each other enough to be direct. Alt was not hostile to Jonah's decision. He had his own view of Dread Cully, formed over years of watching him operate in and around Calder's Crossing. But he wanted to understand the situation clearly. When he left, he turned once and said that he would look into a few things, if Jonah had no objection. Jonah said he had no objection. He stood at the door and watched the Reverend's dark coat grow smaller against the white hillside, and then he went back inside to where Eliza was sitting by the fire, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes asking the question she had too much dignity to say aloud. He's a good man, Jonah said. He wants to understand. That's all. She looked back at the fire. Outside, the light was going fast, and the temperature was dropping, and the mountain was pulling its silence back around itself, like a cloak. December arrived without ceremony, and the world outside the cabin contracted to the dimensions of what a man could see from his own porch. White hillside, dark tree line, pale sky. The mountains above had long since disappeared into cloud, and most days the light was the flat gray-white light of deep winter that makes noon feel like late afternoon and gives the hours a soft, undifferentiated quality that Jonah had spent years learning to tolerate. He had 3 books: the Bible, which he knew well enough that reading it was more like remembering than discovering; the Surveyor's Almanac from the year he had filed his land claim, which contained useful information about the territory, and also a surprising amount of meditative content about measurement and patience; and the volume of poetry that had been Clara's. He had never looked at the author's name on the spine, because the name seemed beside the point. What mattered was what was inside, and what was inside was Clara's handwriting in the margins. Small comments and underlinings that he had long since memorized. On a dark afternoon in the second week of December, he offered the poetry book to Eliza. She took it carefully, the way she took most things, and opened it to the first page. She could read. She had told him this early on, haltingly, as though offering a credential she was not sure would be accepted, but not with total ease. Some of the words slowed her. Some of the older constructions of phrase gave her trouble. He began reading to her in the evenings. He had not read aloud in years, and his voice in the first session was rough from disuse, self-conscious in a way that he recognized as unfamiliar, since he was not a man who was often self-conscious. But by the 3rd evening it had smoothed out and found its natural pace, and by the end of the first week he had stopped thinking about the voice at all, and was simply inside the words, which was the only way reading ever truly worked. Eliza would sit across the fire with her eyes half closed and her hands loose in her lap, and sometimes she would close her eyes entirely, and when she did that, Jonah slowed his pace slightly to give the lines more room. She had a question, always, after a poem, not a literary question. She was not analyzing technique, but a human question. What does he mean when he says the river forgets the rain? Does the man in this poem forgive his father in the end? Or only wish he could? Jonah answered as honestly as he could, and sometimes admitted that he didn't know. And those were the best conversations because they thought about it together. One evening she wrote a letter. She sat at the table after supper with the stub of a pencil and 2 sheets of paper that Jonah kept in the locked box for practical correspondence, and she wrote for nearly an hour. He read by the fire and did not look over. When she finished, she sat for a moment looking at the pages, and then she folded them and set them on the corner of the table. In the morning, the letter was still there. He moved it to the windowsill next to the sparrow, when he swept the table clear for breakfast. She came in from the cold porch where she had been watching the early light on the snow, and saw it there, saw where he had put it, and something briefly crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same country. That afternoon, she sat near him on the porch and said, without preface, "That word I said when you took the sack off. I need you to know that I don't fully understand why I said it. I don't mean to have put something on you that isn't yours to carry." Jonah looked out at the hillside for a while. The snow was brilliant in the brief midday sun. "I know it wasn't calculated," he said, "and I know what it is and what it isn't." Another pause. "What I know is that you are here and that you are safe, and that whatever word it was that came out, it pointed you somewhere decent. That is enough for me." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "What matters is what we do from here. That is what you said." "Yes," he said. "That is what I said." 3 days before Christmas, Hector Briggs rode up the mountain himself, which he had not done in years. His knees made riding hard, and the trail made riding harder. He arrived red-faced and stiff-legged, his horse blowing and unhappy, and he was in no mood to be thanked for the effort. So Jonah didn't thank him. He helped him off the horse and got him inside and put coffee in his hand, and then Hector told them what he had come 3 hours through hard weather to say. Cully had gone to the county seat. He had filed papers with the county clerk claiming that Eliza was a bonded servant under a legitimate contract of indenture, and that Jonah had removed her by force, and without legal authority, which constituted theft of contracted property under the statutes of the territory. The petition was scheduled to be heard by the county judge in 3 weeks' time. If Jonah did not appear and produce a lawful counterargument, the judge would rule by default, and a default ruling in Cully's favor would give the man legal standing to recover what he was calling his property by whatever means the court sanctioned. Eliza sat with her coffee and heard this with her usual stillness, but her hands, Jonah noticed, were wrapped very tightly around the cup, and the knuckles had gone pale. Jonah was quiet for a long time after Hector finished. The fire settled and a log shifted, and the cabin was very still. "Then we need to tell the truth louder than he tells his lies," Jonah said. Hector nodded, which meant he had been hoping Jonah would say something like that rather than something that would require more argument. After Hector left, rested, fed, and marginally warmer than he had been, Jonah went to the high shelf and took down the locked box. He opened it on the table and began looking through its contents with the systematic attention of a man taking inventory before a journey. Title deed to the cabin and the benchland, filed with the county 19 years ago. Trade receipts going back a decade. Clara's letters from before they were married, tied with a piece of cord, a folded survey map of the upper drainage, and at the bottom of the box, in a square envelope that had softened and slightly yellowed with years of careful handling, May's birth certificate, written out in the county clerk's careful official script. Margaret Clara Pike, born the 14th of January. To Jonah Henry Pike and Clara Ann Pike, née Moss, at the residence of the above, Greyhorn Valley, in the 3rd year of the statehood. He did not know yet why he thought of it now, in the context of legal proceedings about Eliza. He simply took it out and held it in both hands for a moment, reading the familiar lines, and then he folded the envelope and placed it in his coat's inner pocket, where it would stay until it was needed. He did not know yet that it would be needed in ways that would change everything he thought he understood about the shape of his own life. 2 days after Christmas, the holiday observed at the cabin only by a modest fire and a meal of venison that Jonah had taken from a doe in the lower meadow, Reverend Alt came back up the mountain. He had been there before the holiday, and Jonah had expected him, but this visit was different from the beginning. Alt arrived in the afternoon with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Jonah recognized as the expression a man wears when he is carrying information he is not sure how to put down. Jonah poured coffee. They sat at the table, all three of them. Alt looked at Eliza for a moment with something that was between professional assessment and genuine concern, and then he folded his hands on the table and began. He had been making inquiries, he said, quietly through his church correspondence, which extended across 4 counties. He had wanted to understand Eliza's origins before the court date, because he believed that the truth of the situation, fully documented, was the strongest possible argument against Cully's petition. He had written to the parish records of 3 counties east. He had written to a retired circuit judge of his acquaintance. And he had received, 3 days ago, a reply from a lay preacher in the Harlan Valley who had been keeper of that district's birth and settlement records for 30 years. Eliza was born in the Harlan Valley. As she had told Jonah, her mother had died when she was an infant. She had been placed with the Crane family, and here Alt paused and looked at Eliza again, by a young woman passing through, who said she could no longer keep the child safe in her current circumstances. The young woman had given a name for the record. She had given the name May Pike. The room became very quiet. Jonah's face did not change. Or rather, it changed in the way that a body of water changes when something large passes beneath the surface. Everything rearranged, but from above, you could not have said precisely what had moved. Alt spoke carefully. I want to be certain before I say more. Eliza, do you have any keepsake? Anything at all from your earliest years, before the Cranes? She looked at Alt for a moment, then at Jonah, and then she reached inside the neck of her dress and drew out a thin brass chain. On the chain hung a locket no larger than a thumbnail, oval, dented on one face, the catch slightly stiff from years of not being opened. She held it for a moment without opening it, as though deciding something. Then she pressed the catch and the locket opened. Inside was a photograph, small and faded and cracked at one edge. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, dark hair, fine bones, and a particular way of holding her head, slightly tilted, as though listening for something just at the edge of hearing. Jonah went still in the way that he had gone still in the livery yard, completely from the inside out. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded piece of worn paper. From inside the paper he drew a photograph, larger than Eliza's but from the same era, the same quality of light and shadow that old photographs carry. He laid it on the table beside the locket. The same woman, younger in Jonah's photograph, perhaps 17, standing straight with her hands clasped at her waist, and the particular expression of someone trying to appear composed while feeling something entirely different. Older in Eliza's, more settled in her own face, but unmistakably the same, the eyes, the angle of the jaw, the listening quality of the tilt. Clara. 20 years ago. The photograph taken the year before Jonah met her. The silence in the room was the kind that has physical weight. Alt's voice was very quiet. The Harlan Valley record states that the child was left in the autumn, 8 years ago. The child's age at that time was given as approximately 1 year, which would place her birth in the year May disappeared, Jonah said. The words came out with a steadiness that cost him something. Alt nodded. Eliza looked between the 2 photographs on the table, hers and Jonah's, and Jonah watched her understanding arrive in stages, the way dawn arrives, too gradual to point at a single moment, but undeniable once it is there. She is not my daughter, Jonah said. He needed to say it to be precise, because the alternative, to let the imprecision stand, felt like a kind of lie. But if this is what it appears to be, if the woman who left you with the Cranes was truly May, then you are her daughter. You are May's child. He looked at Eliza directly. You may be my granddaughter. The word sat in the room between them, like something set down carefully on a fragile surface. Eliza did not cry. She was not, Jonah had come to understand, a person who cried easily. The habit of emotional display had been trained out of her by circumstances that rewarded composure and punished openness. But her face did something he had not seen it do before. It opened. Some deep, long-maintained structure of wariness and self-protection relaxed in her face the way a fist relaxes when it finally lets something go. And what was underneath was not vulnerability exactly. It was something more like relief. The relief of a person who has been lost for a very long time and has just recognized a landmark. Jonah stood up from the table. He said, "Give me a moment," and he went outside. He stood on the porch in the cold December air and looked up at the mountain. The peaks were clear today, for the first time in weeks, white and enormous and absolutely still against the pale winter sky. He stood there for a long time, breathing the cold air in and breathing it out, and the things moving through him had no names yet, and he did not try to name them. There was a particular quality to grief when it begins, very slowly, to transform into something else, something that is not grief's opposite, not happiness or relief exactly, but rather a kind of astonished gratitude, raw-edged and almost painful in its intensity. Jonah stood in that quality of feeling and let it do what it needed to do. May had survived. Whatever had happened in the autumn of her 9th year, wherever those unshod horses had carried her, whatever difficult and frightening and perhaps terrible path her life had taken in the years after, she had survived. She had been alive long enough to have a daughter. She had been alive long enough to place that daughter carefully, with a name attached, in the care of someone who would keep the record. She had thought about the future. She had made a plan, however imperfect. She had tried. He did not know where she was now. He did not know whether she was still alive. He did not know anything beyond the bright, solid physical fact that she had not disappeared into nothing, that she had continued in the world, that she had lived, that the grief he had carried for 8 years had been built on an absence that was not permanent death, but something far more complicated and far more full of possibility. He went back inside. Eliza was still at the table. Alt had his hands folded and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has delivered his news and is now allowing the recipients to manage it. Jonah looked at Eliza. She looked at him. "You said the word without knowing why," he said. "Yes," she said, "and now we know why." She nodded slowly. Her fingers rested on the open locket, touching the edge of the tiny photograph. Jonah pulled his chair closer than he normally sat, and he folded his hands on the table. He looked at her with the straightforward, uncomplicated directness that was the most honest expression his face was capable of. "Then you are not a stranger to me," he said. "You never were. Whatever happens next, in court, wherever May is, all the unknown things, you are not a stranger. Do you understand that?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. Her thumb moved gently over the face in the photograph. "Yes," she said at last. And then, with a deliberateness that showed she understood precisely the weight of the word she was choosing, "I understand." Alt cleared his throat softly. He reached across and closed the locket gently with one finger, easing the stiff catch shut. On the windowsill, the carved sparrow and the folded letter sat together in the last of the afternoon light. And outside, the mountain held its permanent and patient silence, and in the cabin the three of them sat with the truth of a thing that had been coming toward them since October, finally arrived. The morning after the revelation, the cabin was very quiet. Jonah rose before light as always, and built the fire and put the coffee on. And when Eliza came to the table, she sat down across from him, the way she always sat. but the quality of the silence between them was different. It was the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere and are still orienting themselves to the new landscape. Not uncomfortable, never quite uncomfortable between them now, but careful and honest in the way that important silences are. She wrapped her hands around her cup. After a while, she said, "Is she alive, do you think?" "I don't know," Jonah said. "I believe she was 8 years ago, or close enough to 8 years, when she left you with the cranes. What happened after that, I have no way of knowing yet." "Yet," Eliza said. She had noticed the word. "Yet," he agreed. She looked at the sparrow on the windowsill. "She named it, didn't she?" she said. It was not a question. She had come to understand, without being told, that the sparrow had a history that predated her arrival. "She called it Thomas," Jonah said. "She was 4 years old and could not explain why." Eliza was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Thomas is a reasonable name for a sparrow." It was the first thing that had ever come close to lightness between them, and it did not feel misplaced. It felt like the first true evidence that the ground they were standing on was solid enough to hold something more than grief. Reverend Alt had left the previous evening with a promise and a plan. The court date was in 2 weeks. They would need to appear with documentation, testimony, and the truth of Eliza's origins, which, properly presented, would dismantle Cully's fraudulent claim entirely. Alt would gather what he needed from the church records and from his contact in the Harlan Valley. Hector had already indicated he would attend and speak to Cully's character, or the lack of it, from his own direct experience. Jonah spent 2 days composing his written statement at the table in the evenings, working slowly and crossing out and rewriting with the patience of a man who has learned that the right words, properly arranged, are worth waiting for. He had no legal training, almost no one in the territory did, but he understood narrative, and he understood that a judge faced with 2 conflicting stories would inevitably ask which one held together under examination. His would hold together. It would hold because it was true, and truth has a consistency to it under pressure that fabrication, no matter how practiced, eventually fails to maintain. Eliza wrote her own statement, separately, without being asked, in the careful but increasingly confident hand that the evenings of reading had strengthened. She asked Jonah to read it and tell her if there was anything unclear. He read it twice and told her it was clear throughout, clear and direct, and more forceful than anything he could have written on her behalf, and that he would not change a single word. She received this with a simple nod and folded the pages precisely and placed them in the locked box with the other documents. On the 4th day before their departure, Hector sent word by Orvis that 2 more people from Calder's Crossing had offered to ride to the county seat and speak. One a local farmer named Aldrich, who had lost a hired man to one of Cully's fraudulent debt claims 3 years prior, and one an elderly widow named Mrs. Garrett, who had witnessed the scene in the livery yard and had been, according to Hector's note, carrying the guilt of her silence like a stone in her shoe ever since. Jonah read Hector's note aloud to Eliza. She listened with her hands flat on the table. "They don't have to do that," she said. "No," Jonah agreed. "They don't." She looked out the window for a moment. "People are strange," she said, not bitterly, reflectively, with the tone of someone genuinely revising a long-held assessment. The morning of the day before they were to ride, Eliza stood at the edge of the benchland looking up at the sky. Jonah came to stand beside her and looked where she was looking, and there, high above the cabin, circling in a wide thermal above the tree line, was a large hawk, red-tailed, moving in the effortless tilted way of birds that have fully recovered their confidence in the air. "Is that ours?" she asked. "Could be another one," Jonah said. "Hard to say from here." She watched it for a moment. "I choose to believe it is ours," she said. He did not argue with that. He stood beside her and watched the bird circle until it drifted south above the ridge and was gone, and then they went back inside, and the day continued toward its preparations. On the second evening before they were to ride down, Jonah sat alone after Eliza had gone to sleep. He picked up the carved sparrow and held it in his palm in the firelight, the way he had done for years. He spoke to it quietly, the way he had always spoken to it, to May, to Clara, to the version of himself that had broken apart in the autumn of his 40th year and had not fully reassembled since. He told them what had happened. He told them what he had found. He told them that he did not know what was coming, the legal confrontation, the longer search for May herself, all the unresolved questions that now had at least the possibility of answers, but that he was going to face it with a clear mind and a straight back, which was the only thing he had ever known how to do. When he finished speaking, he sat for a while in the silence. Then the sound came from outside. Horses on the lower trail, moving slowly, the creak of tack in the cold night air, more than 2 horses, coming from below. Jonah set the sparrow down and rose without hurry. He took his rifle from the pegs and his coat from the hook and went to the door. He could see the torchlight below, 3 torches moving up through the pines. He stepped off the porch and walked to the tree line. He stood in the dark at the edge of the pines and waited. They came out of the trees and into the clearing. Cully and 2 men Jonah did not recognize, but whose quality he recognized immediately. The torchlight made harsh shadows of their faces. Cully pulled up his horse a dozen yards away. He looked at Jonah standing at the tree line, with the rifle held loosely and without theater, and something moved behind his pale eyes, a recalculation of some kind. "Pike," he said. "Cully," Jonah said. His voice was level and unhurried, the voice he used on the mountain, the voice that had nothing to prove to anyone. "I am a patient man," Cully said, "but patience has its end. I am offering you one more opportunity to return what is mine and walk away from this without further cost to yourself." Jonah looked at him for a long moment. The torches moved slightly in the wind. Somewhere in the pines behind him, a small branch released a load of snow with a soft, collapsing sound. "You have filed your papers," Jonah said. "I will answer them in court, with witnesses and with documents that will end this matter clearly and permanently. That is the only conversation you and I will ever have." A brief pause. "Now get off my mountain." Cully did not move for several seconds. He looked at Jonah with those colorless eyes, and Jonah looked back at him with eyes that were the warm brown of old wood, and absolutely immovable. Cully turned his horse. His men turned theirs. They rode back into the trees without another word. Jonah stood at the tree line until the torch glow was gone entirely, and then a while longer. The mountain was perfectly silent. The cold was deep and clean, and above the tree line the stars were very bright, the way stars get in winter when the air is cold enough to clarify everything. He went back inside and hung his coat and replaced the rifle on its pegs. Eliza was sitting up on her cot, fully awake, her back against the wall. She had heard. He met her eyes. "It is handled," he said. "We leave day after tomorrow, as planned." She studied him for a moment in the firelight. Then she lay back down and pulled May's quilt up to her chin. Jonah sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. In the morning, he thought, he would take the deed out of the locked box and tuck it in with May's birth certificate in his inner pocket. Because a man going to court ought to carry the documents that established who he was and what was his, not as evidence of anything more than the plain truth of his life, but because the plain truth of his life was exactly what needed to be on the table. In the morning there would be preparations and packing, and the long ride down the mountain. There would be Hector and Alt and the others waiting in Calder's Crossing, and together they would travel the remaining distance to the county seat with their documents and their testimony, and the quiet but unbudging intention to make Dread Cully's fabrications collapse under the weight of fact. In the morning, everything would begin moving toward its conclusion, but tonight, the cabin was warm, and the door was latched, and the woman who might be his granddaughter was sleeping under her grandmother's quilt. And the carved sparrow sat on the windowsill in the last of the firelight, head tilted, listening, patient as the mountain itself. And for the first time in longer than Jonah could accurately recall, the quiet of the mountain felt not like an absence, but like a presence, something gathered and waiting, something just on the other side of what was still unknown, that had the character, if he was honest, of hope. The county seat was a day's ride from Calder's Crossing, a proper town by the territory standards, with a bank and a newspaper and a courthouse that had been built from actual cut stone rather than rough timber. The courtroom itself was a plain, high-ceilinged room that smelled of pine resin and old paper, with benches along the walls and a raised platform at the front, where Judge Howard Pruitt sat with the compact, unhurried authority of a man who had presided over a great many arguments and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. He was perhaps 65, with a close-cut gray beard and reading glasses that he wore low on his nose and peered over constantly, giving him the expression of a man who is perpetually checking whether the world matches what is written in front of him. He was known, Alt had told Jonah on the ride over, as a fair man, not a merciful man, not a theatrical man, simply a fair one, which in Jonah's estimation was the only quality a judge truly needed to be worth respecting. Cully sat on one side of the room with his lawyer, a nervous young man from the county seat who had been presented with a difficult case and knew it. Cully himself sat with his arms crossed and his pale eyes fixed on some middle distance that contained neither the judge nor the people who had come to oppose him. He had the posture of a man who believes that composure is the same as confidence, and who has not yet discovered that judges are experienced enough to read the difference. Jonah sat on the other side with Eliza beside him, Alt at his left, Hector behind, and Aldrich and Mrs. Garrett in the row behind that. Cully's lawyer presented his case first. It was, as Jonah had anticipated, smooth and practiced, an argument built on the language of legal obligation and settled debt, referencing documents that Cully had brought and that his lawyer read from with the emphasis of a man hoping that the solemnity of his delivery would substitute for the solidity of his evidence. The core claim: Eliza was bound by a contract of indenture. Jonah had removed her. The law required restitution. Alt presented the church records and his correspondence with the Harlan Valley lay preacher, documents establishing Eliza's origins clearly and placing her outside the jurisdiction of any debt or contract she had had no part in making. Hector presented his ledger, opened to 3 pages of entries going back 5 years, and explained in his flat, unhurried way that it documented a pattern of fraudulent debt claims associated with Dred Cully's name and associates across 2 counties. The judge examined the ledger with careful attention, turning pages slowly, his reading glasses pushed all the way to the tip of his nose. Then it was Eliza's turn. She walked to the front of the room and turned to face the judge. She stood the way she had learned to stand, straight through the spine, hands still, eyes direct. She did not look at Cully. She looked at the judge, and she spoke. She told her story in plain language, with no embellishment and no appeal to sympathy. She told it the way she had lived it, factually, in sequence, with the measured clarity of someone who has thought about these events many times and has learned to carry them without letting them carry her. The room was very quiet while she spoke. Even Cully's lawyer had stopped his note-taking. When she finished, Cully's lawyer rose and began his questioning. It was aggressive, designed, Jonah understood, to create the impression of inconsistency, in the hope that what he could not disprove directly, he could cloud enough to create doubt. He questioned dates. He questioned the circumstances of the placement with the Crane family. He questioned the chain of custody on the church documents. Eliza answered each question in the same level, unhurried voice in which she had given her testimony. She did not become flustered. She did not become angry. She did not become anything other than exactly what she was, a person telling the truth in the presence of someone who needed the truth told to him clearly and without compromise, and she was equal to the task. Judge Pruitt watched her over his reading glasses throughout the cross-examination. When the lawyer finished and sat down, the judge was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents on the desk before him, the church records, Hector's ledger, the pages of Alt's correspondence. Then he turned to Cully. "Mr. Cully," he said, in the tone of a man who has reached a conclusion and is confirming one remaining detail before he states it formally. "The contract of indenture you have submitted as your principal exhibit. Can you produce the original document bearing the genuine signature of this young woman or her legal guardian at the time of signing?" Cully leaned toward his lawyer, The lawyer shuffled papers. The silence in the room stretched out past the point of comfortable waiting, past the point of ambiguity, into something that had a verdict's texture. The lawyer said quietly that they would need a brief continuance to locate the original document. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Cully. The look did not require a great deal of interpretation. Judge Pruitt did not grant the continuance. He asked the lawyer to sit down, and the lawyer sat down, and the judge looked at his papers for a moment, and then removed his reading glasses entirely and set them on the desk with the particular finality of a man who no longer needs to check anything. Jonah placed May's birth certificate on the desk before the judge. He did not present it as evidence of Eliza's parentage. They had not yet proved that connection beyond reasonable question, and the judge had not been asked to rule on it. He presented it as the anchor of his own identity. Jonah Henry Pike, father, landholder, citizen of the territory for 19 years, a man whose history in this place was documented and real, and entirely at odds with the portrait Cully's lawyer had tried to sketch of a rough mountain man operating outside the law. The judge examined it with the same careful attention he had given everything else. Alt then presented his final piece, an elderly woman from the Harlan Valley. He had arranged for her testimony to be given in writing, witnessed and signed by the county clerk of that district, who remembered clearly the young woman who had brought an infant to the Crane family 8 years prior. The description in the testimony was specific: young, perhaps 17 or 18 years of age, dark-haired, tired-eyed, moving with the urgency of someone traveling under difficult circumstances. She had given the child's name as Eliza. She had given her own name as May Pike, and she had asked the Crane family to keep the record, to keep the name, because the child had a grandfather somewhere who would want to know. The judge read this testimony twice. The room was entirely still. He set the paper down. He looked at Cully with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal and is not angry because anger would be, at this point, superfluous. "The petition of Dred Cully is dismissed," he said. "The claim of indentures found to be unsupported by credible documentation and is declared fraudulent under the statutes of this territory. The young woman Eliza is free in the eyes of this court, free as she has always been in the eyes of any law worth its name. Mr. Pike committed no unlawful act. The matter is concluded." He turned to the county marshal, who was standing at the side wall, and said that he would like Dred Cully and his associates held pending a broader review of the debt claims in Hector's ledger, which he intended to refer to the territorial prosecutor's office. Cully was escorted from the room. He did not look at Jonah. He did not look at Eliza. He looked at nothing in particular. The look of a man whose accounting has finally come due, and who is arranging himself to the fact of it. The room released its held breath slowly, the way rooms do when something has been resolved that has been building for a long time. Jonah and Eliza stood together in the center of it. People were moving around them. Alt speaking with the marshal. Hector retrieving his ledger from the judge's desk with the careful attention of a man collecting something of value, and the two of them stood in the middle of the motion like a fixed point, looking at each other. "What do we do now?" Eliza asked. It was the practical question, the obvious question, the question that was also somehow the largest question, because what came now was not an end but a beginning, and both of them knew it. "We go home," Jonah said, "and then we find May." The word home landed between them with weight. It was a word she had not used about any place for as long as she could remember, and hearing him use it about the cabin, hearing it applied to a place that included her, did something quiet and significant to the architecture of the way she understood her own position in the world. She nodded. Outside the courthouse, Hector came alongside Jonah and put one large hand briefly on his shoulder and said nothing. He did not need to. Alt offered a prayer that was, characteristically, brief and honest and entirely without ceremony. Aldrich shook Jonah's hand. Mrs. Garrett looked at Eliza for a long moment with the expression of a woman making good on a private debt, and said, "I should have spoken that day in the yard. I am sorry I didn't." Eliza looked at her steadily. "You are speaking now," she said. "That is what mattered today. Mrs. Garrett pressed her lips together and nodded and looked away, and Jonah thought that Eliza's answer had been more generous and more precise than anything he could have managed. They walked out of the courthouse and into the winter afternoon, and the light was thin and cold and clear, the particular clarity that only comes in January in high country. And in it, everything, the street, the stone walls, the white mountains visible at the end of every sightline, had the quality of things that have been seen truly for the first time. They rode back up the mountain in the last week of January, when the snow was deep and the days were short, and the cold had the settled, permanent quality of a winter that has fully committed itself. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, door latched, fire cold, the sparrow on the windowsill in the dark. And stepping back into it after the days away felt, for the first time, like the word Jonah had said in the courthouse, like coming home. He built the fire while Eliza unpacked the saddlebags, and within the hour, the cabin was warm and the coffee was on and the mountain had closed quietly back around them. A letter was written that first evening, Jonah at the table, Eliza beside him, both of them contributing words, until it was right. It was addressed to the county clerk of the Harlan Valley District, and it asked for any records or subsequent information relating to a young woman named May Pike who had passed through that district 8 years prior. It asked for any forwarding information, any witness accounts, any thread of documentation that might indicate where May had gone after leaving the child with the Crane family. It was carefully and respectfully written, and it made no dramatic claims and asked for nothing beyond what records might exist. When it was sealed and ready to be carried down by Orvis on his next pass, Eliza placed it on the table and put her hand flat on it for a moment. Not a gesture of sending, exactly, but of commitment. Of saying, "This is real, and we are doing it." Jonah made no comment. He put his coffee on and sat back down, and they were quiet together in the good way. The evenings resumed, the fire, the poetry book, the questions after each poem. Eliza's reading had grown substantially over the months. She moved through the almanac and most of the Bible and began a second pass through the poetry with a confidence that was a pleasure to witness. On cold afternoons, she sat at the table and worked through the poems independently, her finger tracing the lines, her lips moving slightly over the harder words. Once, Jonah came in from the lines to find her laughing alone at something in the book, a small, private laugh of genuine amusement, and he did not interrupt it. He simply moved quietly to the hearth and put the kettle on. In the 3rd week of February, he carved the second sparrow. He worked on it over several evenings, the same white pine, the same small knife, the same slow approach of letting the shape declare itself. He did not try to make it match the first one exactly. It was a little larger and its posture was different, less the listening tilt of the original, and more an upright, forward-facing attention, as though it were looking at something ahead rather than waiting to hear something behind. He set it on the windowsill beside the first when it was finished, and adjusted their positions until both caught the morning light. Eliza came to the table in the morning and saw them. She stood looking at them for a long moment. "Two," she said. She sat down at the table and put her hands around her cup and looked at the 2 sparrows in the early light, and her face had the open quality it had had since December, since the evening Alt had put the pieces on the table, and the world had rearranged itself into something larger and more complicated and, in the final accounting, more full than it had been before. They did not know yet whether May was alive. They had sent the letter, and they would send others, and they would follow whatever threads the territory offered, and they might find her, and they might not. That uncertainty was real, and Jonah carried it honestly, without pretending to a peace about it that he had not fully earned. But the carrying of it was different now. It was not the dead-end grief of not knowing. It was the open road uncertainty of searching, which is a different weight entirely, and a manageable one. He had paid $3 in a livery yard on a cold October afternoon, not out of any plan or philosophy, not from any expectation of return, but simply because he could not walk past it. And the world, which had been extraordinarily and specifically unkind to him for 8 years, had returned on that investment in ways that no reasonable accounting could have anticipated. He had found his granddaughter on the end of a coin purse. He had learned that his daughter was not a grave he would never find, but a person he had not yet located. He had built a fire in a cold cabin for someone who needed warmth, and in doing so had received back something he had long ago stopped believing the world still held for him. Not all at once. Not easily. Not without the hard passage through grief and patience and the slow, deliberate work of trust. But fully. He stood at the cabin door one morning in early March, when the light was beginning to return in earnest and the snow on the south slopes had started its first tentative retreat. The air smelled of cold pine and the faint, almost imagined suggestion of something beneath it, the soil thinking about spring, the world's long patience, with winter beginning to exhaust itself. Behind him, on the windowsill, 2 sparrows caught the morning light. Somewhere in the mountains, in a direction not yet known, his daughter was alive. And beside him, at the table, with a cup of coffee and a poetry book and a face that had learned, slowly and at great personal cost, how to be unguarded, sat the granddaughter he had not known he had, in the home she had not known she would find, on a mountain that had always been large enough for 2, if only someone had known to come.